In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is episode 193. We are on our countdown to 200. Very much looking forward to that episode. And this past week, I had what I called a major announcement. There's been a new change for me, and I have accepted the position of executive director at Faith Ascent Ministries in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm very excited for the opportunity. It's going to be a chance to be doing apologetics for teens, Christian teenagers, and it's really a wonderful opportunity. And as I've told some friends and family, it's my ticket out of the state of Illinois, which is not in the best fiscal shape. We also have an update here on the program. So a couple points to note. First, today, we have finally caught up with all of our old episodes on YouTube, and we are streaming now live to both Facebook and YouTube. This is something that Chris and I have been excited to get to for over a year now, and Chris has put in a lot of the hard work of going through the old episodes, because some of them were just audio back in the earlier days, and Chris had to go through and do editing on those. And then it got a little faster for you, Chris. But finally, we're caught up and very excited to be at this stage. And the second point to note about the program is that as the way things presently stand, I will be taking an indefinite hiatus after episode 200. So while we finally reach this benchmark, we're going to have to say pause to Veracity Hill as the way things stand now. Things could change in the coming weeks. There are still discussions happening between the two different boards of the organization. So there's a chance things will continue on. But nevertheless, it's been so great for so many years to be putting out this weekly content to you, and I hope that we'll be able to continue to do so in the future. But at any rate, I wanted to give all of you that update. If you have questions, feel free to email me, kurt@veracityhill.com. We've had some questions from our donors, like what does that look like? Let me talk about that too briefly before we jump into our discussion today. For our supporters, thank you so much for the years that you have given to our program. As long as there is financial support coming in, Chris and Mark will continue to do work for the Veracity Hill ministry. Now, that's if the indefinite hiatus goes on for a long time. There is still work to be done for this ministry. There will be 200 interviews and episodes of content to comb through, material to clip and upload, and to continue the Veracity Hill ministry. So please continue supporting this ministry, and if you don't already, please start chipping in $5, $10, or $20 a month. We'd love to keep your support coming in so that the ministry of Veracity Hill can continue on. And again, there's still discussions going on, so things may change, but I just wanted to give you what the present course of action is right now. All right, well, I'm excited for today's discussion. The New Testament studies is something that I have a hobby in, not a formal training. I was an undergrad student at Biola. I studied philosophy and political science. I double majored. Then I went on to study theology, Christian apologetics specifically, and then systematic theology. And then, as many of you know, I've received my doctorate in theology. I study the doctrine of original sin, so historical theology in 5th century Southern, from the monks from 5th century Southern France. Now, I received my doctorate at the same institution where our guest today received his doctorate, the University of Aberdeen. And our guest today is the highly esteemed Dr. Darrell L. Bock. He's the Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he's the Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Howard G. Hendricks Center for Christian Leadership and Cultural Engagement. He's the author of a more popular book called Breaking the Da Vinci Code, and he's debated many people. One name that many people on our program have heard, Bart Ehrman. And perhaps most importantly, he is a strong consumer of God's gift to humanity, Dr. Pepper. Dr. Bock, thank you so much for joining us on our program today.
Real pleasure to be with you. Glad to join you.
All right, so the focus of today's episode is on historical Jesus studies, and I wanted to sort of just take a broad overview of this field. You are the editor or co-editor of a recent book, Jesus, Skepticism, and the Problem of History, put out by Zondervan, and we're going to be sure to put a link at our website so people can purchase this strong collection of essays from some of the who's who of evangelical New Testament scholars. And first, let me, before talking even more about the book, let me ask you this very broad question to start. What is the field of historical Jesus studies? Shouldn't people just read the Bible and know what and who Jesus was and is today? Isn't it that simple?
Well, would that it were that simple in an age in which there's a lot of skepticism. The historical Jesus studies really goes back to the 18th century in the introduction of doubt about Scripture. Let me take one step back and talk about apologetics for a second. Apologetics really has three core buckets, the way to think about it. On the one hand, there is philosophical apologetics, which is, does God exist? The problem of evil, do miracles happen? Those kinds of things, the things that you probably dipped in pretty deeply when you were at Biola. Then there's biblical studies apologetics. That has to do with the way in which the Bible is seen and talked about in the public square. And that's basically where my work generally falls. And then the third is what I call public square apologetics, which are the variety of issues that come up where the Christian faith and the way in which the world sees things differ significantly. So that's sexuality, abortion, LGBTQ issues, all those kinds of areas. And those three areas very rarely talk to each other. So I'm glad to be talking to a philosophical apologist about biblical studies, because those sections rarely touch with each other, and yet they're important conversations to be a part of. So historical Jesus studies goes right in that biblical studies bucket.
Yes.
There were people who said the Bible, isn't an inspired book. It's a collection of a variety of disparate writings that got put together. There's a 60-year gap between when some of the Gospels were written, John, and the events. So we can't know that what they record is really true, those kinds of things. And historical Jesus studies was an attempt, originally mostly by skeptics, to try and figure out, all right, what gets through that sieve? And in the late 18th century, there was a thing called Lessing's Ditch. Lessing's Ditch was the supposed distance between the real Jesus or the historical Jesus and the biblical Jesus. And the argument was it was like a Grand Canyon. It was very difficult to cross. And so historical Jesus studies was an attempt to build a bridge back between the gap, if you will, to see what survived. Now, historical Jesus studies has gone through three periods of significant work. And sorry to take a long time to answer the question, but it's important to the background.
Yeah.
In the first period, what's called the first quest, doctrinal and philosophical presuppositions overlaid the conversation so that, miracles went out because miracles didn't happen. The category of myth was raised as describing what the Gospels were as opposed to being history because of this mix of things, that kind of thing. And the first quest ended at the beginning of the 20th century with a book written by Albert Schweitzer in which he looked at all the historical Jesuses that came out of the first phase and said, they're all so different. How in the world can we think we've accomplished anything? And then there was what was called the silent phase. That's a little exaggerated because a lot of people were still writing about Jesus, but not in an organized historical Jesus kind of way. Then in 1953 came the second phase in which German scholars who had been students of Rudolf Bultmann, probably one of the chief skeptical New Testament scholars of the 20th century, said we can know more about Jesus than our Dr. Father, our Dr. Father. Dr. Vater would be the German phrase. Said because he basically said we can know next to nothing about the historical Jesus. And these students, Ernst Käsemann was the first to do this. His name, he did that well. His name can be translated cheese man. Anyway, said we can know a lot more about Jesus, particularly his ethics. And that was the second phase. And the second phase came out of a period in which the gospel units were studied as short pieces that were passed on in oral tradition, that kind of thing. We may come back to this down the road. And then in the third quest, which really started to emerge in the 60s as a reaction to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 40s, people said, you can't make sense of the historical Jesus without understanding him and his Jewish background and the Jewish context out of which he comes. It's been the most conservative of the three phases overall. And has produced a boatload of writings in this regard to say that we actually know a lot more and can show a lot more about this is who Jesus was by the standards of normal historiography than people previously thought. So the core to historical Jesus, now I'm answering your question finally, the core to historical Jesus studies is the idea that you can take standards of history, apply them to the documents of the Bible, and still get some sense of content about what you can show about who Jesus is.
Yes. Okay. So there was a lot you brought up there. So, gosh, where to begin? So you noted that I have a training in philosophy as an undergrad student, and there has been some drama recently between philosophers and evangelical New Testament scholars. And I am strongly sympathetic to the view of evangelical New Testament scholars more so than the philosophers. And unfortunately, I don't think the philosophers have spent enough time studying or even thinking about the subject matter. And I think they're operating, I'm classing together some philosophers here. And some people who are following along with this know who I'm talking about. These philosophers are operating under what I would say are false premises, false assumptions, incomplete information, and are trying to justify their not as deep, I don't want to say shallow, but not as deep read of the New Testament and the difficulties therein. So I actually have a talk that I will be releasing soon on the argument from undesigned coincidences, wherein I critique some proposed cases of undesigned coincidences, and basically I call for modesty here, that it depends on how the sources used each other. If Matthew had Mark, that affects certain things. So at any rate, I don't want to go on the tangent there, but yes, I have an appreciation for the general camp of evangelical New Testament scholars and their devotion to the text and taking seriously these issues. And that is one of the purposes of the book, isn't it, Dr. Bock, that you're saying if we apply these methods, these historical methods, to studying the New Testament, and we apply them consistently, that we're going to still come to the real Jesus, who is the Son of God, and that the Scripture is divinely inspired. So it's not that Christians should shy away from historical method. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. Let me go to your earlier comment. I think that's very true, that most philosophers operate at a conceptual and abstract level that doesn't get into the details of the text and the details of what people are dealing with. And as a result, they tend to say things that don't really reflect the nature of the problem and the discussion as it exists about the text. And so, and that's a problem. You can deal with at least creating openness towards what's going on in the text through your philosophical discussions. That's for sure. But your philosophical discussions, for the most part, aren't helping you with the kinds of details that you see in the text, the cultural environment that it comes out of, the way in which ancients wrote and what their expectations were about history, all those kinds of things, which are certainly part of what God used as he inspired these ancient authors to write in the context in which they were writing.
Yeah.
And so that's a very, very important observation.
And it's not as if New Testament scholars themselves don't disagree, say, about like Bible backgrounds, like what is the other side of conversation, what were these values. But for someone to just come in to a conversation without having spent years studying and really knowing the field, then you're like, well, wait a second here. Let's have you spend a few years reading this stuff. Now, one fellow I can think of who's very well versed in both camps, of course, is Dr. William Lane Craig. And he's got 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and the other in New Testament. So he's, quite well versed on these discussions, and has feet in both camps, which is great. We need more folks like that, I would say. So,
no, that's very true. And then there are others who roam into my world who, when they roam in, I go, well, nice to see you. Why don't we sit down and talk for a while before you espouse what it is that you're saying about what's going on here? Because I can introduce several kinds of issues that I don't think you've quite addressed very, very clearly. And this is actually one of the reasons for these various groups to be talking to one another,
yes, for sure,
rather than about one another, which is sometimes what happens.
Yep. I do want to note here, we've got Ringo Cat on YouTube watching us from Scotland. He says, love this topic, and gives a heart, a little icon, or I don't know if that's an emoji. Could be. Ringo, thank you for watching, and also appropriate name coming from the UK, Ringo. That's kind of nice.
Yeah, he must be a star.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we talked about method, and I want to get into covering. There's so much that's been written in New Testament scholarship, so there's so much that could be said. But I want to sort of have an introduction here to these different areas of study, these subfields. And a number of the essays in the book cover the subject matter. So perhaps you can give us an overview of things like textual criticism, memory, the criteria of authenticity or embarrassment, these sorts of subfields. I know you're smiling because you're like, man, we could do an episode on each thing here.
That's exactly right. Yeah, let me start with the most basic question, and that is, what is the relationship of the Gospels to one another? Because everything kind of flows out of that. If you talk to New Testament scholars about the Gospels, you're going to get a variety of opinions about how the Gospels relate to one another, which Gospel was first, which Gospel used what Gospel, etc. And this obviously impacts everything else that you say. So it's the starting point. Now, it is fair to say that most New Testament scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel written. And they might date it variously. Some will put it in the late 50s or early 60s. Others may push it back to the 80s. But generally, 30 years or so after the life of Jesus. And the reason they say that is that Mark's outline is pretty much embedded in Matthew and in Luke. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke together are called the Synoptic Gospels. You can look at them together. Synoptic is 2 Greek words meaning see together. So you can look at these Gospels together because they overlap with a lot of the same events. In fact, fully almost 95% of Mark is either in Luke or in Matthew. So, and its outline is mostly followed, which means that Mark is either the first Gospel written or the last Gospel written. It's the only way to explain that phenomenon. At least it's the best way to explain that phenomenon.
Yeah.
And then most people say, well, Mark is unlikely to be last because although we claim that would make Mark kind of a Reader's Digest version of the other two, in the places where Mark overlaps with Matthew and Luke, he actually has more information rather than less, which doesn't look like a Reader's Digest version at all. So, and plus there are omissions in Mark in that third slot that don't make sense. There's no, for example, presence of anything having to do with the infancy material. There is no version of the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, depending on whether you're in Matthew or Luke. And that's obviously seen as one of the most important ethical pieces of Jesus's teaching. So it's hard to explain why those would be omitted if Mark were third. Now, there is historical evidence of Matthew being claimed to be the first gospel by Papias. And so this is the one obstacle to this view. And Matthew refers to a Jewish background that Matthew wrote basically in the Hebrew dialect and was the first gospel written. And that is the one obstacle to that view. There are various explanations for what Papias is alluding to here, including the idea that he may be just dealing with the circulation of the teaching tradition about Jesus rather than ultimately a formal gospel, or the roots behind the gospel as opposed to the formal gospel itself, although that's hard to argue. Another is that he writes in Hebrew style as opposed to writing in Hebrew. That doesn't affect the timing of the event. A third explanation is, well, the early church tended to elevate the apostolic gospels, that is Matthew and John, over Mark and Luke because they were connected to apostles as opposed to being connected to people who followed the apostles. And so that explains its primary position. It's probably the best explanation, perhaps. And then, of course, because you have geographic spread, it may be that certain gospels reach certain parts of the Christian world first, as opposed to being written first. So that's another explanation for what's going on. So all that to say, Mark is the first gospel written for most New Testament scholars. Then you've got about 200 to 250 verses that Matthew and Luke share of Jesus' teaching. And there are two explanations for how this can work. One used the other, or they shared a traditional source of some kind, whether it be oral or written or a mix. And again, the issue here is that they're distributed so differently between those two gospels that the idea that one gospel writer would use or know the other is hard to establish, not to mention the differences in the infancy material between Matthew and Luke that doesn't look like they're using one another. So that leaves you with this 200 to 235, 250 verses. The number is various depending on how you count some of the material. But that's fully almost a fifth of either of those gospels. What most scholars have said is there's a source called Q, which is a shorthand for Quella, which is the German word for source, which was a collection of Jesus's teaching material that resided in the church. And it was passed on strictly as a collection of Jesus' teaching material. And Matthew and Luke both drew from this source. They did so in different ways, but it was the same kind of material, because if you read these verses, a significant portion of them agree almost exactly. Another very significant portion are very close to one another. And then there's about a third to a quarter of it where you could go, is this part of the collection or not? And that's why I've given you the variation of verses, because it reflects that difference. That's Q. So that's a second source. Then you've got the independent material that Luke uses and the independent material that Matthew uses. And then you've got John, which is about 85% unique material as well. And you've got the bulk of the source material that feeds into the Gospels as we have them. Those are the building blocks around which historical Jesus scholars work to even have their discussions about criteria or anything else. So that's why I started there. And I think I'll take a breath, let everyone catch up and see if there are any follow-up questions about that before we move on to anything else.
Chris, my technical producer, would understand this, and followers of the Risen Jesus podcast. I feel like Dr. Bock just condensed season 2 of the Risen Jesus podcast with Mike Lacona, which you should subscribe to. Dr. Bock, you just condensed it down to 5 minutes.
That's right. That's my job.
Yeah.
So,
but for those
10 paragraphs can be reduced to 1 if you work hard.
That's right. Yeah. So, and for those that want to go even deeper in looking at the synoptic problem and the problems associated with the various quandaries here, please go watch the second season of the Risen Jesus podcast.
Well, let me add an addenda or a footnote to that, since you raised it that way, and it's this: that the problem that you have with the Gospels is that you have agreement and difference side by side and all mixed together. And so you've got to be able to deal with, how do you get so much agreement on the one hand, and how do you get the level of difference that you have mixed into it at the same time. Anyone who reads two parallels, a parallel of a single event in the Gospels, will immediately notice the gist of what's being said is almost consistently the same, but the number of detailed differences that you have is also present. So how do you deal with both of those? And the philosophers that we were talking about earlier, because we can't leave them behind because they keep looking at what we say, you have to deal with both of those elements simultaneously in how we get there.
Yeah.
And that's been the problem in dealing with the gospel. If we didn't have the synoptic gospels where they overlap, we probably wouldn't have some of these discussions. But the overlap is what is, and the nature of this agreement, difference, mix, similarity and difference simultaneously is what gospel scholars often have to deal with when they're dealing with Jesus and historical Jesus questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that, I do want to encourage people that are philosophically oriented or trained. I want to encourage them to read New Testament scholarship, but to do so from an open mind when you are learning. Don't come in trying to just justify your preconceived notions, because as someone who, again, so I taught New Testament exegesis for high school a few years back, maybe several years back now, and I've just always had an interest in it, so it's been a hobby of mine. But I just see that the conversations New Testament scholars have and the questions they're dealing with, they're just light years ahead of some philosophers and their concerns over scriptural integrity, or one subject matter is gospel differences. I mean, so you see people that are so far behind, they should just consider themselves students instead of wanting to be an authority as if they're 30 years up on the literature. I mean, so we really should approach New Testament studies from a learning mentality, so that way we can really encounter what I think are the genuine problems from a humble, modest approach. Now, I think that when we study New Testament scholarship and when we apply these historical methods to the New Testament, there may be some issues we can't get through the fog on, but generally speaking, we can. And that the Jesus that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John describe is the true Jesus. And so we don't have to obviously remove our faith, and maybe we'll have some doubts, or maybe we'll have some doubts about segments here and there. Like maybe we'll have a doubt about hey, how does Luke copy from Matthew here, or is he using his own source? Those are certain questions where we may not have an answer, and we should just sort of end it at that. I mean, given what we know, that's where we're at. And it could be either options. Maybe one is more probable than the other. And New Testament scholars make those claims. They say what's more likely than not, from their frameworks, or what's plausible or what's possible. And sometimes we even propose options which are logically possible, but don't really make sense of the other facts that we have. And in this respect, New Testament scholars are doing philosophy. They are creating a cumulative argument. They're using abductive reasoning, argument to the best explanation, and so they're employing philosophical terms, probable, likely, possible, and they're making good qualifications. So in that respect, and certainly sometimes, let's put the shoe on the other foot here, Dr. Bock. Sometimes New Testament scholars do philosophy not all that well, but generally speaking, I think they're on the right track because of the backgrounds that they have, the good assumptions going in, and in some cases just dealing with the data appropriately. What do I mean by that? Sometimes you'll get philosophers that will just make a blanket statement and treat the New Testament as if almost like in a sense that a Muslim would hold the Quran, as if it's this eternal word that has always existed, and it just doesn't make sense of certain things. One thing that I can think of, Dr. Lacona mentions this in Luke, what he calls editorial fatigue, and it seems to be sloppy reworking. And so Luke is working with material, and all of a sudden something doesn't quite make sense. But, if he was just a little bit tired of, maybe he lost his train of thought, something like that, that seems to be a good rationale for what's happened in a certain, the parable of the talents.
There's a good example of this in Luke chapter 4, where you get the relocation, at least in relationship to where this passage is in Matthew and in Mark, of Jesus' visit to the Nazareth synagogue. And in the midst of this scene in Luke, which is Luke 4, the first thing that happens in the Galilean ministry in Luke, but embedded in the midst of the Galilean ministry in Matthew and in Mark. And in the midst of that exchange, Jesus makes the remark, "You will say to me, do here what you did in Capernaum." Well, there's a small problem. Jesus hasn't been to Capernaum yet in Luke. So, in fact, he's in Capernaum in the next scene. So, but what that represents is a movement of an event to the front of a literary section on the Galilean ministry, in which the scene in Nazareth is a snapshot of what the entire ministry in Galilee is going to be like. Jesus is going to present himself. He's going to get pushed back. And so it becomes a paradigmatic or an exemplary scene for the entire section, which is a perfectly appropriate literary move. But he didn't do all the editorial cleanup necessary to make that move in a way that if you were paying attention to details and you were to look, well, how in the world did Capernaum get in here? We haven't even been there yet. It wouldn't even strike Luke to be a question, because all he did was move the scene forward. And we get examples like that all over the place.
And for those that may be concerned or have a red flag pop up, to move scenes into earlier spots was perfectly acceptable. So I want to clarify, not only was it perfectly acceptable to do so from not caring about chronology, if you say, I did this, and I did that, and I did that. So they could do that. But I also think that it was perfectly acceptable for them to do so communicating chronologically, that they had the license to do that, to rework the story for their readers.
We do it today. We do this today.
Yeah, we do.
What sports report do you know in the newspaper that starts, and they tipped off in the first quarter? Okay. Oftentimes what happens is you get the score. You probably in the next paragraph get the turning point of the game being described, wherever it fell.
Good,
and then you go through your more chronological review. We actually do this today. We just don't think about it.
Yep.
And so when you get these restructures, for the ancient person, in some cases, it's more important that something happened, or that a sequence of things happened that you put side by side than when it happened. And so, for example, in Mark 2:1 to 3:6, we get 5 controversies back to back. They're on top of each other. There's nothing in between. Mark 2:1 to 3:5-6 does this, as does a section in Luke starting in 5:17 and running into chapter 6. But in Matthew, we get the same 5 controversies, but we got stuff coming in between. And in blocks of 3, actually, there's literary structure to the way Matthew does. And so this kind of rearrangement goes on all the time. So you have to ask yourself, what is it that the author is doing in editing the Gospels and in the way he chooses to present the material? Because what Mark is doing is, I'm going to give you 5 controversies right off the bat that show you the kinds of things that got Jesus into trouble. And he wants to do that early on and put them next to one another and show their range. There's another example of the same thing later on in Luke. You get 4, and actually this is also in Mark as well, you get 4 miracles on top of one another. Jesus calms the winds and the waves. He exorcises the Gerasene demoniac of many demons. He heals the woman with the flow of blood, and he raises Jairus' daughter. Those 4 miracles are put back to back. In Matthew, again, they're spread out a little bit. So you get these variations in arrangement for editorial purposes, for topical purposes in these cases, that play. They may or may not play with chronology, but they certainly play with sequence. And so those are the kinds of variations that someone who studies this kind of literature will be used to. because they don't superimpose the idea that chronological automatically means I've got to have the exact sequence. The moment you do that, you've got problems in the gospel.
For sure. And this is another reason why, so I could think of another, the cleansing of the temple.
Yes.
In the Synoptics, it's later. In John, it's first thing for all intents and purposes. And I think the event was such a culmination of Jesus' authority that while it's a logical possibility that it happened twice, I think given the context and the impact that that event had, John is basically saying, this is the guy who's got authority all of this stuff, over all of it, and you should listen to him. Let me tell you more about him. So I think that that's why John places it at the start of Jesus' ministry in his story.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the idea that Jesus could get away with cleansing the temple twice is very, very unlikely.
That's right. Fully agree.
That once he did it, he'd be a marked man.
That's right. I totally agree on that. Yeah. Hey, I'm having too much fun here, Dr. Bock, but I've noticed we've gone over halfway. We've got to take a break here. And when we come back, we're going to keep talking about historical Jesus studies and Jesus skepticism and the problem of history. We'll get a little bit more details about this book. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Like Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill Podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com. Click on the sponsor tab. We have 3 different levels of sponsorship. We'd love to help promote your book, your business, your organization, your ministry. It's a great opportunity to get your name out to our followers and a wonderful chance for you to share with them what you're all about and what you've been doing. Well, on today's program, we're talking about historical Jesus studies, and our guest is Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Darrell Bock, and he has not been warned about rapid questions. Is that true? You're like, what's questions?
I think I have an idea. I think I've seen it on other and if you think you can keep me to a few words, the challenge going both ways.
So the idea is we're going to put 1 minute on a gear. I don't think you'll hear the timer, but it's 1 minute, and we want to see how many questions we can get you to answer. These are totally irrelevant to our discussion. It's just a chance for us to get to know you a little bit better about who you are as a person.
I'll only answer yes or no.
Okay, well, I've got a few of those, but...
Go ahead.
Okay, here we go. Taco Bell or KFC?
Neither.
Most hated sports franchise?
Ooh, the Dallas Cowboys. Anybody but.
Okay, morning person or night owl?
Definitely a night owl.
What's your favorite color?
Probably blue.
What's your favorite pizza topping?
Pepperoni.
What's your favorite season?
Being in Australia when Dallas is in summer.
What occupation would you never attempt?
Ooh, that's a good one. I have no idea.
All right, here's a person.
Probably circus wire walker.
Okay, a personal question. What's the first name of your childhood crush? I think that's the first time we've had that.
The first name of my... I have no idea. You have no idea how old I am.
I don't think we've ever asked that one. I've got a list here.
And that's why.
So for those longtime listeners, I've got a list I work off of, and you'll hear common ones that are kind of my go-to questions, and then I mix in a few different ones from time to time. And after so many episodes, that's the first time I've asked that one. Childhood crush. I mean,
the last time you asked it.
Perhaps. Now, I normally ask whether someone drinks Dr. Pepper, but as we've already alluded to and mentioned on the program, you are an avid Dr. Pepper drinker. In fact, you have a cup on your desk right now filled with the heavenly beverage.
Filled with Dr. Pepper, and coming from Dickey's Barbecue in Dallas, which is a franchise around the country. I highly recommend both, and I wasn't paid for this political announcement.
Okay, I do want to ask you, before we jump back to our discussion, you mentioned anybody but the Dallas Cowboys. Now, you live in Dallas.
I'm a Houstonian in exile, okay?
Oh, okay.
So it's a little bit like San Francisco, L.A., or
Right.
Boston in New York. You
Right.
got it? So Philly in New York, you can go that way, too.
So I'm going to be in your shoes. I'm a avid Chicago Cubs fan, and I've just accepted a job in St. Louis with a wonderful organization.
I have a lot of advice to give you for your psychological well-being.
We're going to have to stay in touch and start like a support group, I think, because
Exactly right.
the worst thing about this whole new situation for me is everyone is a Cardinals fan.
That's right.
So
Yep. But St. Louis is a nice place. You'll be okay.
yeah, it does seem like a nice city for the few times I've been thus far. All right, we've got Bible Fandom is watching. He says, enjoying today's discussion. I really enjoyed Bock's TNTC commentary on Ephesians. So,
Yeah, thanks.
okay, talking about historical Jesus studies and getting back to the subject matter of today's episode.
Known as Beyond Pepperoni. Go ahead.
So I want to cover some of these criteria if we have time. But okay, so maybe I'll do this. I'll conflate some of the questions I have.
You want to do rapid questions with criteria? We could do that. You can name the category, and I'll try and do it in less than a minute.
Hilarious. I don't even know if I'd have enough questions because you could probably do well there. Let me ask you. So what was the impetus for this book, Jesus, Skepticism, and the Problem of History? There's so much already written in New Testament scholarship. What contribution does this make to the field?
Well, there was in the early part of this decade a book that raised the question of the value, the criteria of authenticity that are applied to try and adjudicate whether a passage has value or not.
Mm-hmm.
Those criteria cover a variety of things. I actually laid the groundwork for one of the more important ones, which is called multiple attestation, in going through my little overview before the break. Because multiple attestation is how many different source strands present the topic or the idea that you're dealing with. And the idea is the wider the distribution across the source strands, the more likely this theme or idea is a part of Jesus' teaching. And so So this book questioned the value of those criteria, to which our response was, if you're going to dump the criteria, then what are you going to be left with in your historical Jesus discussion? Where does this leave us? So we assessed the strengths and the weaknesses of the criteria on the one hand and tried to make a case that they're still usable, but recognizing that all of dealing with ancient history is always a put back together affair of a puzzle pieces in which you only have a select amount of data to deal with. And then making the case for how Jesus studies should proceed given the issues that criteria do have, but on the other hand, the value that they may still possess for us.
Okay, so let me ask you maybe something a bit of a harder follow-up here for this criteria of multiple attestation. As you know, there are sources from classical antiquity that are the only source for some historical event. And yet in many times, we don't call that source's reliability in question at all. And maybe it's safe to say we just take it for granted that that person is telling the truth. So why is it that multiple attestation then is so important for Jesus studies?
Well, it's important for Jesus studies because actually, if you look to see what can be applied with regard to multiple attestation, you can get pretty far to who Jesus is, regardless of whether you're going to debate the singularly attested material. That's important. So, for example, one of the ones I like to use because I think it is the example for the nature of the problem. Jesus' favorite name for himself is Son of Man. And it is not only multiply attested, it's like multiply attested all over the place. He is the only one who uses the phrase in the Gospels. It's reserved for his own self-use. It's in all the strands of the traditions, even in some of the sub-strands of the tradition. I mean, it couldn't be more multiply attested. It is a high Christological title. Son of Man means human being on the one hand. But Son of Man tied to Daniel 7 rides the clouds, and there's only one figure in the Old Testament who rides the clouds. That's God. So you've got a human being doing God stuff. And this is Jesus' favorite way to refer to himself. I am the Son of Man. And you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. You know, those kinds of sayings.
Yeah.
And so what you've got is a title that refers to himself that both has human and divine elements mixed into it as his exclusive self-reference. And it's multiply attested. That takes you to a high Christology. So that's an example of something that shows up that's really of significance and really runs through all the strands of the Gospels as Jesus talks about himself. And boom, you've gotten over a bar, even a high bar, and you've at the same time established to some degree who Jesus is and how he talks about himself.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that if we only had a single source, we could still think that source meets the criteria for reliability? When we have cases of multiple attestation, that just goes, really high in the charts. So it's not like...
In one sense, yes. I mean, that's probably the most popular criteria that gets used is multiple attestation. Yeah. But the singularly attested stuff, there are other tests, there are other criteria that you can slot into the conversation that can help you. Let me give you one. Criterion of embarrassment. This is the idea that the early church would never make up the story this way, that if it were a created piece, it would never be created in the form in which it's been created. This actually applies to the resurrection in a significant way.
Yep.
We have women who are the first witnesses to the resurrection. Now, let me play this out, okay? So Jesus has died, okay, and it's Saturday. And you're in the meeting that the disciples are having. How do we keep hope alive? Our Messiah was just crucified. Doesn't look good. Okay, and so they're discussing what the PR possibilities are for how to do this. And someone raised their hand and had a great idea. Okay, let's take an idea that most of the culture doesn't believe, resurrection. The only people who believed in resurrection were Pharisaical Jews. The Sadducees didn't believe it. The Greco-Romans didn't believe it. They thought it was too wild-eyed an idea to really believe. Okay, so we're going to take this difficult idea, and then we'll claim. Now you're making this up, remember, so you can do anything you want. We'll claim that Jesus is raised from the dead and the tomb is empty. And the people that we will make the first witnesses for this story are women who in the culture don't count, generally speaking, as witnesses. So you're going to take a difficult idea, you're going to tie it to witnesses who don't count culturally, and that's how you're going to keep hope alive. And he proposed this at the PR meeting, and all the people said, what a great idea, that's how we'll do it.
Yeah, that's how we'll win over the culture, yeah.
Exactly right. So, I mean, none of that makes any cultural sense at all.
Yeah.
And so the point is, the criteria of embarrassment basically says they would never create a story like that. Judas is another example. You know, the idea that a perfect Jesus, because by the time you're talking about the creation of ideas in the church, you're dealing with the church that has an exalted Jesus. So we've got this exalted, perfect Jesus who chooses Judas, okay, to be one of the 12. Okay, would you make up that story? Another example, Peter, okay, in the 3 denials. Okay, is this a way to present your church leadership, including the leader of the leaders? Would you make that up? Or another one, Peter denying that Jesus is going to suffer, and so Jesus calls him, "Get behind me, Satan." Is that another one? I mean, I just look at Peter's resume. He is someone who represents Satan, okay, and he can't stick up for himself or Jesus at all. Okay, that's how you're going to present your leader. So that's the criterion of embarrassment.
Right. And so it's all the more reason to think that this is reliable, what they're telling, what the narratives are telling us. Because if they were just written up, contrived, ad hoc, then they wouldn't have put that stuff in there. And
I'm embarrassed I took more than a minute to explain that.
Oh, yeah, right. Great. Okay, we are running short on time. Let's cover a few other ones. Talk about textual criticism. That's a little different than...
textual criticism is a sideshow on most.
I'm sure Dan Wallace loves hearing that.
yeah, that's right. Well, we keep social distance here. Yeah, and the reason I say that is all textual criticism is doing is saying we know that the text that we have of the Gospels is the text that the Gospel writer wrote.
Yeah.
Okay.
It deals with the hard evidence, the manuscripts.
That's a whole separate question from whether what they say is true or authentic or not. So most people, when they have the discussion about the reliability of the New Testament, actually miss this. They think by talking about the quality of the text that we have, and for an ancient book, it's the best attested text that we have anywhere by miles. Okay, even by planets. Okay, it's just well attested. But that doesn't deal with the internal content of what you have and the authenticity of the content of what you have. That's a whole nother level of discussion. And too many Christians, when they engage in apologetics, say, if I can establish what the text is, I've determined the authenticity of that text.
Right. Yep.
You've determined the authenticity of the words of the text, but you haven't determined the authenticity of the events described by those words.
Yeah, and so to give an example, just to play it out for folks, you could write Lord of the Rings, a fictional work, and have that preserved, 99% of the original. That doesn't mean Lord of the Rings is historical narrative in the nonfiction, category.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So they are distinct, but they're both helpful, and then they do answer different questions, like how do I know what I have today? Because frequently
you have to know what the text is to know what you're going to be talking about.
That's right.
So it's the starting point at one level, but it is very much short of being the whole discussion.
Right, and one of the most popular objections, especially among young people, I heard this a lot in high school, was it's just copies of copies of copies. And so textual criticism will say, well, wait a second. It's a little bit different than that. Let me ask you about your essay that you wrote in the work here. You went through a test case, Jesus' remarks before the Sanhedrin, or the Sanhedrin. I've heard it pronounced different ways. Tell me about that. What's something to be concerned about, or the issue at stake in that example?
Well, here's the first level issue. The first level issue is how in the world do we know what was said at this event when there was no other Christian there but Jesus? And remember, you're dealing with people who don't have a theological point of view. So the idea of appealing, well, Jesus was there, he could have attested to it after he was resurrected. You're not allowed to go there. Okay, so how are you going to go there?
How about Joseph of Arimathea?
Well, here we go. There's a whole list. I actually got asked this question by Bart Ehrman at SBL Regional, and that was exactly the way he asked it. There were no Christians present. How in the world do we know who was there? And my initial thought was, well, I could talk about a resurrected Jesus, but he wouldn't be happy about that. So I'll just leave that to the side. And so what I did is I went through the list. There's Joseph of Arimathea. There is who was on the Sanhedrin and knew what it was about. There's Paul, who was the persecutor of the church from Jerusalem and certainly knew the Jewish position and the Jewish exchanges about Jesus. Then here's one to think about. There's a family feud going on in Jerusalem. That family feud involves the house of Annas and Caiaphas on the one side, who represent official Judaism, and Jesus' family on the other, because who was head of the church in Jerusalem after Jesus was crucified? It was James, his brother. Okay? And they're debating in Jerusalem, a city of between 25 and 75,000 at the time, about who really has the truth with regard to Judaism in the public square. Okay? You've got people who serve all these people who probably were in the room, who also could be possibilities. I mean, the number of options that are present here are really, you've got the debate that would have happened between the Jewish leadership and the early church in Jerusalem about what was going on with Jesus and the various views that. It's like saying a Republican has no clue what a Democrat believes, or vice versa. So there are lots of ways for this kind of information to have gotten out and to be presented. And then the key of the event is the way in which Jesus answers the question when he puts together Psalm 110:1 and Daniel 7 and says, in effect, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Father, coming on the clouds of heaven. This is another high Christological saying that is tied to the event. It actually says, you can do with me whatever you want, but I'm making a prediction for you. And the prediction that I'm making for you is that God will vindicate me regardless of what you do, and you will see my authority one day, and you will be able to write me at www.righthandofgod.com. And so in light of that, then he's not only answering the question positively, he's giving them more than they asked. They asked if he was the Messiah. He says, well, Messiah is not a bad title, but I'm Jewish. I'll go for more. I'm going to be at the right hand of God. And I'm going to be your judge one day. You may judge me now, but I'm going to be your judge one day. That's actually what he's saying. So there's a lot wrapped up in this scene. And this article goes through the background of the scene, the historical case for the scene, and using standard historical approaches and methods argues for the authenticity of the scene.
Great. Okay, final question here for you today. You invited some big names to respond to the collection of essays here, Responses and Reflections, as it's titled. The late Larry Hurtado, Scott McKnight, and Nicholas Perrin. So tell me, what is there to be concerned about what you guys are doing? What's so bad about it?
Well, fortunately, for the most part, those guys said not too bad. Scott McKnight has questions about the entire historical Jesus exercise because he doesn't like the idea, and this will sound like a philosophical presuppositionalist. He doesn't like the idea of the church trying to base its credibility on what it is able to show and prove, et cetera, particularly when what can be shown and proved is so disputed. Okay. And that's been a standard objection to the historical Jesus approach all the time. What makes Scott interesting, a person about this, is that he was engaged in this conversation for a long time before he withdrew from it. And there's an element of that I actually get, but here's the problem. The problem is that the church is in a mission to reach people in the world. And when you reach people in the world and they don't have the kind of warrant that you are presenting from within the church for what someone could or should believe, you've got to think about a different way to engage them. And so to simply say the Bible says it and that's great, or this is the Jesus that the church has dealt with that has had such an impact on the culture, all of which is true, okay, that isn't going to help the person for whom the Bible is not a inspired book, who could think about the Bible in a variety of ways, either a helpful religious source or a source on ethics, or maybe they just think the Bible's a mess. How are you going to address that person?
Yep.
This is a way to have that conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's a tool. It's a tool for bringing people back to Christ, for winning them over. It's a tool for Christians themselves to employ and to be edified in this pursuit. So, Dr. Bock, thank you so much for joining us on our program today, for enlightening us of the field of historical Jesus studies. And I want to encourage people to purchase the book, Jesus, Skepticism, and the Problem of History, put out by Zondervan. Criterion content in the study of Christian origins. Great big names, collection of essays here. Everyone should have it on their shelf, even if only as a resource in their personal library. So, Dr. Bock, thank you. We'll have to stay in touch, and like I said, maybe start that the support group for.
Yeah, it's called Exiles Anonymous.
Yeah, there we go. We've already got a name. That's great. Wonderful. Thanks so much. God bless you.
You're very welcome. Anytime.
All right, well, that does it for the show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons, folks that just chip in a few bucks each month. And I'm also grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for all the fine work that he does today, for our guest, Dr. Darrell Bock. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.